The Florida Podcast Network, the voice of Florida.
From Mallory Square in Key West to the Governor's Mansion in Tallahassee and all points beyond, you're listening to the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com, your source for all things related to the craft beer community in the Sunshine State. And now your host, Dave Butler.
Welcome back to our final episode at Gulf Stream Brewing and Distilling. This is the Florida Beer Podcast, and I am Dave, your host and author. Thank you so much for listening to our first episode a couple weeks ago with Tom Magadino from Pizzeria Magadino, who has set up shop inside Gulf Stream Brewing, which was our last episode 181, and this is episode 182, and we'll chat with Gulf Stream Distilling. Now, it's going to be the same people. We're still talking to Ty Eriks, the co-founder and co-owner of Gulf Stream Brewery, Noah Aguilar, the co-founder and head moonshiner at Gulf Stream Distilling, and Daniel Kastner, who is actually the head distiller and a former brewer himself. We're going to continue the conversation. I promise you it's going to be just as slightly unhinged as before, but instead of talking about the beer with Gulfstream's name on it, we're going to be talking about the spirits. And if you know anything about making spirits versus making beer, it's wildly different in a lot of ways, not just the actual production, but all those legal issues as well, which is why you can't actually walk into Gulfstream Brewing right now and purchase a bottle of Gulfstream Distilling vodka or gin. You have to go someplace else. And I'm going to recommend that you go someplace else, especially that gin. And even if you don't like gin, try their gin. It is phenomenal. Trust me. There's some other stuff that's coming up in the future, but I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to let Ty and Noah and Daniel talk about it instead. So here we go with Gulf Stream Distilling. Enjoy. And of course, another next step that a lot of breweries in basically the country have started to do that I've noticed is becoming the big theme is not beer at all, but spirits. I guess first and foremost, why do craft breweries, why do people that make beer, why are spirits, which are infinite? Let's start with that question. How much different is it to make a spirit than it is making a beer? If you've actually done both.
Dan,
really,
you've done both, sir.
I've done quite a bit of both.
And I've been told by people,
our resident wizard will answer this question.
And I've been told by people that make rum for a living but we're homebrewers, that making beer is significantly harder.
Oh yeah, beer is way harder. You have to be the cleaning and the sanitizing alone for making beer is incredibly tedious compared to spirits, where you want infections to happen. We can walk next door afterwards. You can look at the tanks I have, and they're all open top fermentation tanks.
That's amazing. Wow.
They're all have crusty and gross looking, but all the bacteria and the wild yeast that gets into it creates all the phenols, the acids that create the fruity flavors, all the really interesting character in a spirit.
So at what point did, hey, the brewery is phenomenal, let's make spirits? When did that conversation get started?
Well, these are actually sister companies. So there's separate ownerships, and we decided to collaborate with the Gulf Stream name because that is the next kind of step especially for the brewery in terms of the tap room and all that. So we started that conversation, and gosh, 2 years later now.
Yeah.
2 years later now?
Absolutely. 2 years later.
Yeah, and it's been a great relationship. We do a bunch together. Actually, there's some things in the work here that we may have some of the spirits show up here in the tap room, but we'll see.
Well, that's interesting that you have the same name, but if you take a look at the Gulf Stream logo, the label for the beer and for the spirits, the iconography is very different.
Yeah.
Why stick with the same name and different iconography when you could easily have just done kind of like Four Hands up in St. Louis and just have a different label for the spirit arm? of
Yeah, I
things.
mean, I think a different ownership had different ideas what they wanted to do with their labels. I mean, ours is more for, especially our cans, are more for a beer shelf, right? It's more for, hey, how do we stand out on a beer shelf? And that's not necessarily the same thing for spirits, right? So, you know, they make a very nice bottle. It's very, very classy and clean. And I'm not saying that ours is not, but it's just beer and spirits are very different. And how it sits on the shelf and how it sells is very different.
Yeah, I think the marketing had a lot to do with the decision that we made in this, doing the labels different. You know, they have an iconic label on theirs, which represents, you know, the elements that go into the beer itself. Whereas ours is more focused on the rum running and the idea and the concept of the spirits coming into Fort Lauderdale from the Prohibition times. So actually, if you look at that little boat, that's kind of like a little rum runner boat that's on ours. So, yeah, to make even though we're sister companies, but we still have to stand out on the shelves, you know, to be proficient for ourselves.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that you're really kind of going for that historical aspect, that educational aspect. Is that something that you wanted to do to sort of appease the rum running gods for good distilling?
Well, in all honesty, like the families that are financially supporting us are some of the founders of the Fort Lauderdale businesses here in town, like some of the founding fathers here.
Yeah.
So we've got a good backing of it, and it really made sense to us. I think it all sort of gelled when we did our first event, which was with the Historical Society to celebrate one of the family members.
Yeah.
And I think we sort of said, you know what, I think that we're losing our culture here in Fort Lauderdale, and people need to be aware of like where we come grounded in this.
Yeah, no, 100%. I was at that event, and I agree.
That's amazing. So there weren't a whole lot of breweries in Fort Lauderdale when the brewery was started. There were even less distilleries. What was that process
there was
like
only
building?
one.
No, there
South Florida.
There were seven. Well, and in Fort Lauderdale, there was when I first came up with this concept of building this distillery, there was only 7 distilleries in the whole state of Florida.
Oh my goodness.
So I've been working on this project for quite some time now. I started moonshining in my backyard for like 10 years.
The Florida Beer Podcast does not advocate moonshining in your backyard. I have to say that.
They can't find me.
Listen, I tried it. I didn't buy it. I sampled it. Make sure it wasn't poison.
Well, in lieu of that, it was like, so, you know, it was all just kind of having fun, you know. No, I'm not going to even say that. That's going to incriminate myself. But so we started with the experimentation phase of things, and then once it started to become reality, because like for me, I was making like blueberry moonshine in the backyard. Then I graduated to making bourbon, because like bourbon was originally what I wanted to make initially. So I was making bourbon. Actually, Dan has been a huge supporter of me. He was working at a shop, and I was going down to ask Dan questions about things. I mean,
so previous to Tarpon River, I was working at Craft Beer Cartel, which
Yeah.
used to be a really big
Oh, yeah, I remember.
homebrew shop, bottle shop.
I used to buy my homebrew stuff there myself.
Yeah.
Yep. And I remember when Adam was there, and go right across the street to Riverside. And,
Yeah, I was there for it's like 3.5 years before I went over to Tarpon. And
I might have bought some homebrew stuff from you, to be
probably
perfectly
sold you a
honest.
lot of booze, and we just
Yeah.
yeah, it was wild, man. So I mean, this guy was like my resource. I was like, in all honesty, all I knew what I was doing was from text, and there was a lot of unanswered questions, and there was a lot of things about like water profiles and like and different enzymes that you add to things. So I would go to Dan, because Dan was working at the shop, and Dan would always help me out, and we sort of we became friends over the years, and I would and then Dan started to get into it as well, especially over the COVID period.
During COVID.
And it was just kind
Weird.
of
Why is that?
synergy.
Why did you get into it over COVID? That's kind of weird.
Furloughed.
I had to drink something.
It was like, 3 months of furlough, and I was going stir crazy sitting at home, so I went down the Reddit rabbit hole of a Firewater subreddit.
Nice.
And started reading some books, and then started building stills in the backyard. And
Yeah, it's truly a backroots, it's like a backroots program, man. We were just kind of like, wing nuts doing our thing, and At one point, I had about 6 different barrels of bourbon sitting in my backyard aging, and they were small. There was anything from 5 to 10 gallons. And then we started transitioning into agave spirits because I'm actually from Arizona, and I grew up on tequila, and that's what I love. And so we went from like bourbon to tequila. Well, I can't say tequila. It's agave spirit. The cartel come down on me. They're probably watching me right now. And
Right above you.
we spent some time with some gins, and then I kind of had this idea of this gin. I spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia in my career, and I kind of wanted this warm weather sort of gin flavor. So I had an idea, and then I sort of passed it on to Dan, and then Dan perfected this whole thing. I mean, he's amazing at what he does.
So, what is a warm weather gin? What is a tropical gin like? Because obviously, I've got the juniper in my mind, but
what I ended up doing was marrying a lot of classic London Dry gin ingredients with the Southeast Asian spices that he was incorporating with the gins in the notes that I found in his notebooks and we were talking about. So I just found balance with all the flavors and sort of brought it together so that you had the fruitiness from the citrus that also provided a little bit of acid to the mouthfeel of the drink. And then I brought in the juniper, of course, but not so much juniper that it was astringent and unpleasant like a lot of other like mass-produced gins are. I want something really approachable to everybody and drinkable. And then brought in cardamom, coriander, Thai basil, galangal, and some other spices to just all build around it and layer in all the spices so that you get all these flavors, but it's all balanced and just really drinkable for all the hot weather that South Florida is.
And obviously with a lot of new liquor labels, they will go for the clear spirits first because you can crank those out pretty quickly and not have to worry about all the aging. Did you decide to start with the gin?
No.
No? Okay. So we didn't go with the gin. I don't think we're doing the agave spirits. What was first?
Well, actually, we started with the agave spirits. I've got a warehouse next door that's filled with barrels that I've filled up in the past year and a half. And then as we started moving towards distribution, selling bottles, that channel we started moving towards developing the gin recipe a little bit further and then tweaking our vodka recipe a little bit. Those are definitely driving our sales, but I've got tons of surprise coming out in the next couple of months and years. That's
nice, but that's got to be difficult to make a vodka recipe because everybody's got a vodka. There's so many vodkas. I feel like that's the
water.
Traditional 2-gallon plastic jug beverage of college drunkards off at the beach everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, so more than half of it is going to be the water. So there's some water chemistry behind it to make something that's approachable and not going to burn, and it's not going to be astringent. It might not be apparent to everybody, but if you're drinking a lot of it, you'll notice it. And then also the base spirit itself. We're using a wheat base spirit. So a lot of the proteins get carried over, so you get like silkiness and like almost like a velvety texture to the whole spirit.
And not only that, but we got to keep the lights on, man. So we got to sell vodka.
Well, that's actually a good question.
There's that too. But
I've heard a lot of people say that the water profile in Florida, because of how heavily mineral it is very good towards porters and stouts and whatnot.
It is.
Do you find that there are certain spirits that a Florida water profile lend itself better to doing more than others?
So regardless of what I make, I always use carbon filtered city water for all the fermentation side for everything we make here. But when it comes to finishing and final blending, I use reverse osmosis water.
Okay, so you basically try to control everything as.
When it comes to that, yes. There's just so much calcium in the water here that you can start to get little crystals developing in the bottles. So we want something,
Really?
Yeah, like frost on the inside of the bottle, little amounts. It's weird looking.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So you've got all sorts of different surprises that are coming. How much of this was inspired by the culinary background that you currently have?
Honestly,
Obviously, I would assume the beers are no way, shape, or form inspired by your dentistry.
No. Outside of putting mass amounts of fluoride in it, no. I'm just kidding. No, I'm kidding.
But obviously, it's especially with this gin that sounds absolutely incredible.
It's incredible.
For me, honestly, it was like I've been cooking since I was 15. I'm 48 years old now. When I started doing this, I was sort of uninspired in the position that I was in and the boat that I was in. I got introduced to this idea of doing the spirits. And to me, it was like the next level, right? It's like, okay, well, I've done a lot with food. My job is to, as a yacht chef, is to 100% commit myself to whatever type of cuisine you like. When somebody asks my specialty, my specialty is you, because you're the one signing my checks. So whatever you enjoy, that's what I'm going to do.
That's got to be difficult, though, because there's so many cuisines and so many people focus on, whatever their cuisine is.
Well, that's you as the guy signing my checks, but then I also have charter guests who have a completely different idea of what a menu should be. So it's exciting, but you become very versatile in different, in different trades. I mean, I do a lot of artisanal breads, and I do everything from making quesadillas to doing very, very complex dishes. But over time, that sort of fades, and it just becomes routine. And so I took on this project as an inspiration, sort of reinvigoration of making new flavors. And with that, it was the chemistry involved with it is inspiring, and you just want to sort of, perfect something. As a chef, you always just want to make everything right.
But that's got to be difficult, because with the beer, sometimes you have to wait up to a month to taste and see what it's going to
try a year on bourbon before it starts to taste like bourbon.
That's exactly what I was going to ask. Yeah. How difficult is it to do that waiting?
It was very disheartening, because when I put things in a barrel, they don't exactly taste palatable. You have a lot of different esters that are involved in the chemistry of it that transform into these wonderful flavors like vanillins and toasted nuts and honey. Just three that came off the top of my head, but so you're waiting in anticipation to see when all this starts to transform into something that actually tastes good, and it's very nerve-wracking. But, and I committed a lot to it. I mean, the first barrel that I ever did was a 5-gallon barrel of bourbon. It took me 6 weeks working 6 days a week of fermentation. My kids at the time were away for the summer, and their room I had gone and got 5-gallon water jugs, and I had fermentation throughout the entire house. Right, their entire kids' room, both kids' rooms were full of these 5-gallon. So every day I was doing a distillate. Every day I was running it through the still just so I could make 1 5-gallon barrel of bourbon.
All I can see is somebody smoking a cigarette and just throwing it in the house, and the entire thing exploded.
No.
Horrible episode of Breaking Bad.
Like beer, right? So but also at that stage when I was doing this, it was like I was trying to approach it like beer, where everything was so sterile and everything was just it was very meticulous.
Grasp all the codes and German knowledge.
The problem is so many.
You get your green card soon, sisters.
And then you can hold me liable for not knowing the codes. Now I can plead innocent.
There you go.
Of a foreigner.
Most Americans don't know what half of the stuff is, which is why I like to feature it on the podcast.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You people just don't know.
Yeah.
It's true.
But there is something that I do want to talk about, and it is bourbon. Because bourbon, I've noticed, well, first of all, it's a particular favorite of ours, especially my beautiful wife, loves bourbon. Is it correct in saying that it has had this massive resurgence and all of a sudden now everybody loves bourbon, or has it always been there and I just haven't noticed it?
Popularity for bourbon has definitely exploded in the past 2-3 years, I would say, really since COVID. And it makes it much more expensive to make bourbon now, I'll say that. Trying to find virgin, first use oak barrels is very expensive. There's shortages in the actual oak. So they're planting forests to make the staves to make the barrels. And so I wouldn't be surprised if you see your bourbon prices crawling up in the next couple of years quite a bit.
I'd like to touch base on that a little bit too, because it's an American spirit. So the DOA on bourbon is it has to be made in the United States, and I think yes, it's become more expensive, and definitely bourbon prices are going to be going through the roof. But this is our spirit. It's an American spirit, and I think there is a good resurgence of us as a country in whole, especially when with all the media and the internet that's going on. Everybody's got their own thing. Champagne comes from Champagne, and the cognac comes from the Champagne region and the whole thing. But bourbon is the one thing that we can hold true as Americans. That is, it's ours.
Which is funny because I was always under the impression that bourbon had to be made in Kentucky.
Yeah.
Just Kentucky bourbon.
Just Kentucky bourbon has to be made in Kentucky.
That's yeah.
So Florida bourbon needs to be made in Florida.
Well, I guess. And that leads me to the good questions. Like, how do you make it Florida bourbon? Do you want to make it bourbon that says, okay, this is bourbon, but this is Florida as well? Or do you want it to just be bourbon? What did you kind of go for?
I think it's hard to, in our state, to make a contrived Florida bourbon with the resources that we have, because every state's got its own challenges with these, finding the products that you need to make the spirits that you have. And, it's 51% corn, right? Which we do produce a significant amount of corn in the state of Florida. However, we're outsourcing other materials to make it. There's no...
the biggest factor, I think, for bourbon in Florida is the aging. The humidity and the weather here is so unique that, yes, you need to start with good spirit and you need to have a good barrel, but the weather here is what drives the uniqueness of our bourbon, or whiskey in general. Anything that's aged in barrels here in Florida, because the angel share is insane because of the weather, but also you have high heat driving the spirit into the oak staves in the barrels, all summer and all fall and all spring, all of winter. And
it doesn't come out of the wood, is basically
yeah.
what you're saying.
And these little cold snaps we have, and it's crazy. We have these little cold snaps, and I'll taste the barrel before, and then afterwards, in a matter of a couple of weeks, and it's just completely different spirit. So you have to really pay attention to what's in the barrel, because before you know it, it'll just be overwhelmed by oak tannins. So just babysitting your bourbon, anything aged in barrel down here. Otherwise, it just turns into like oak, not shit, but just like oak tannins. Super, super oaky.
Very dry mouthfeel.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. And I guess once those really start to come in, because you also are going to be releasing an agave spirit, and how difficult is it to talk to people about an agave spirit and have them look at you not understanding what you're talking about? You want to say the T word, you have to say the T word, but you can't say the T word because it's not the T word.
Yeah, it's a difficult in a marketing sense as far as educating people on,
proper verbiage.
Yeah, the proper verbiage. But again, we're going back to, with the aging process. Again, we're doing unique things with the liquid that goes into those barrels, and Dan has done fantastic things with using sherry casks, port casks, and bourbon casks. And what we were going to decide on as far as our blending is yet to come to fruition. But a lot of what we're doing is single barrel action and what we're doing. But it's every product that we're putting out, I think is the most important thing to say, is that it's incredibly unique. So we'll have a very limited supply. This isn't something that we're going to be able to do in statewide sort of selling capacity. It'll be a very local salesmanship in what we're producing now at our stage in this business. However, I hopefully will grow enough that...
I see this is very much the same way as craft beer was 10 years ago here in South Florida. It's just going to take time and education. I remember when I first started out in the homebrew shop back in the day, it's just people had very little, especially here in South Florida, had very little idea of what a lot of craft beer was. So it's going to take us a lot of effort, not just on our part, but everyone in the spirits industry, to really educate customers on what we're making. And as a segment as a whole, I think I've seen some numbers from the American Distillers Institute and a few other industry groups that the American agave spirit category is growing as a whole. People are sort of figuring out how to ferment it, because it's not easy to ferment, and it's starting to grab a little bit of foothold.
It's kind of amazing. And this is what we're sampling right now, which is super clean, super crisp.
Yeah, that was an experimental batch for white. I pulled off a few gallons and bottled it up. And it's tasty stuff.
Wait till you taste the aged stuff. It's amazing.
Oh, that sounds amazing.
Instead of the sherry barrel, I was like, yeah, that one.
Liquid gold.
That one.
Obviously, it would be easy for you because so many other breweries and distilleries will kind of go into partnerships where you'll kind of bounce the barrels back and forth. Obviously, you can't do that with the bourbon, but with other spirits, rum, vodka, maybe even the gin or something, have you decided to, or have you started having that conversation that in the future, maybe we'll do that?
I gave Casey one of my ex-port or ex-sherry barrels that I had bourbon in, and I think he's got a stout aging in it right now.
Yep. No, we definitely. That was one of the initial conversations. Pairing the beer with the spirit at some point in time, and being able to taste them at the same time, and taste the notes and do that kind of thing.
Well, for me, it's exciting because, in all honesty, like I come with the passion of it, but the science and technicality of it comes from the other team members. Started with the vision, but it's been an incredible resource to have both the brewery and the distillery working together with our minds on coming up with ideas. I mean, when it comes down to it, that's the most fundamental thing for me the most exciting thing for me is to see us as sister companies coming together and like thinking of different things and the passion projects that go behind it, and with Dan's knowledge on beer and what he had done in the past, the language that's spoken between the brewers here and with Ty, it's fascinating me as more of a layman to this than anything, to be honest with you. Like, I had an idea and I had a vision, and we started to build towards it. But like, these are really the mechanics that make everything happen. And it's inspiring. It's really cool how everybody gets along. I come in here and during the day, I'll be, Dan's over there sweating his tits off, and I'll come in and help him out for a bit. I'm like, Jesus Christ, it's hot. Get the fuck out of here. Come over here to the brewery to get some water and whatnot and everything else. But it's, the language that we're all speaking together is inspiring, and it's good how we all kind of culminate together.
Absolutely.
And it's kind of the best place to really leave off with Gulf Stream, both the brewery and the distillery, whether the name is on a bottle label or a can or a tap handle. It seems like the entire organization or organizations is working together kind of to full effect.
It's a real tight-knit group. It really is. And not just saying that for the podcast. I've always kind of enjoyed, my dental practices. I treat them as family, right? And this is no different. I really see us as family, and we get along and we share things, and we, sometimes we disagree, sometimes we, whatever, but that's part of growth in business, and that's part of being in a family, and I wouldn't want it to be any other way. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
And there we go. Finally, but unfortunately, our time at Gulf Stream Brewing and Distilling is at an end. I definitely want to thank everybody that helped make this possible, including Ty Eriks and Colleen Aguilar. Definitely want to thank you so much for your hospitality. Everybody else that is a part of the Gulf Stream family, and trust me, it is a phenomenal group that they have there. If you are coming out, let me try that. Actually, let me do this again. Next week, we are going to continue our interesting trajectory of how beer and spirits are colliding and partnering here in the state of Florida. But we're going to head to the other coast. And we're going to talk to some people that had been on the podcast before, but never quite like this. We got a couple episodes with them, and that was a phenomenal interview, so I cannot wait to share it with all of you. The best place to find out where all of that is going to take place is on our social medias. We're on Florida Beer Blog on Instagram, X, Threads, and Blue Sky. We are at FL Beer Blog on Facebook because I don't know why. You can email us at floridabeerblog@gmail.com. We are also available at floridabeerblog.com and floridabeerpodcast.com. And when you go to Florida Beer Podcast, you will realize that we are a very proud member of the Florida Podcast Network, an amazing selection of Florida-based podcasts that I heartily recommend you check out. Make sure to like us and subscribe on your favorite podcasting app of choice, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or Amazon or even on YouTube. Make sure to like us, subscribe. You'll get the notifications when those next episodes come out. And if you can, make sure to leave a nice review. It definitely helps other people find out who we are and what we're doing. Our intro announcer is Jeff Brozovich. Field producer is Steve Pekala. Executive producer for the Florida Podcast Network and Grand High Poobah is Jemmy Legagneur. This is David Butler, your host and author. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Florida Beer Podcast. We will see you next week. Thank you so much, and drink Florida Craft.